Lecture 7 is about Pascal versus Descartes on just about everything. We're not done with Descartes yet, because in the last lecture we only compared him as a rationalist with Bacon as an empiricist. But a more fundamental contrast than that controversy in epistemology is the contrast between Descartes and Pascal, his contemporary, who is neither a rationalist nor an empiricist. Pascal does not address the question of epistemology, especially the quest for certainty, but only to refute both what he calls dogmatism, the claim to rational certainty, and skepticism, just as Socrates did. How then is Pascal to be classified? I would call him the first Christian existentialist, if Augustine had not already written the Confessions, which is the book that Pascal's little masterpiece, the Pensées, is most influenced by, next to the Bible. In fact, when Pascal knew he was dying, he gave away all of his large library except those two books. Classical early modern philosophy has conveniently fixed dates and concentration and options. It can be dated from 1637, when Descartes published his Discourse on Method, to 1831, which was the death of Hegel, the last of the great system builders. Its concentration is on the question of epistemology, and its options are three: continental rationalism, especially in Descartes, and Malebranche and Spinoza and Leibniz, or British empiricism in Bacon and Locke and Berkeley and Hume, and German idealism in Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. Pascal does not fit any of these three categories. Every major philosopher for the next 200 years followed Descartes' lead in trying to apply some aspect of the scientific method to philosophy, except Pascal. Descartes tried to make philosophy more like mathematics. He demanded clear and distinct ideas as his content, certain deductive arguments as his method, and absolute rational certainty as his end. Pascal, like Descartes, was himself a great scientist and mathematician, especially in probability theory, and Pascal also invented the world's first crude working computer. But he saw philosophy not as a science, but as a way of life, to be lived rather than merely thought, and as depending on the heart as well as the head. His most famous use of calculative and quasi-mathematical reasoning was strictly practical. It was his famous wager, which he used to prove not that God exists, but that believing in him is our only chance for happiness, and the most reasonable wager in the world. Because, as he says, if you win everything, and if you lose nothing. The medieval marriage of faith and reason is not quite in a state of divorce yet in Pascal, as it would be in atheists like Hobbes or Hume, or even in a state of total separation, as it is in Descartes, who is both a Christian and a philosopher, but certainly not a Christian philosopher. But it is certainly loosened in Pascal. Both faith and reason were narrowed by both Descartes and Pascal. On the one hand, Descartes narrowed the meaning of reason to scientific reason, something totally impersonal, and on the other hand, Pascal narrowed the meaning of faith to something very personal. He is skeptical of arguments for the existence of God because he's seeking what he calls not the God of the philosophers, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the saints and mystics, not a concept, but a fire. These two philosophers are opposites even in what they see in philosophy itself and how it begins. Pascal begins with experience, in fact, universal human experience, the undeniable fourfold data of universal experience that we all desire both certainty and happiness, and that we cannot attain either of these two things that we desire. Descartes begins not with experience at all, but with universal methodic doubt. He claims to find certainty in rational thought alone in his famous "I think, therefore I am," and he claims to deduce all the rest of his philosophy from that. Their models or influences are also opposite. Pascal wrote his masterpiece, the Pensées, the Thoughts, after he gave away all his books except the Bible and the Confessions. Those two books were his model. Descartes, in contrast, says that the only subject he studied in the university that gave him satisfaction was mathematics, and that was his model for philosophy. Pascal says that such a philosophy is worth about a half hour's trouble. Descartes sees his new philosophy as the foundation for the new science that will transform the world into a utopia. The difference between these two is not total. Both were believing and practicing Catholics, and both were successful and original and brilliant scientists and mathematicians. Pascal invented the world's first working computer, the world's first public transportation system, and the vacuum cleaner, as well as much of probability theory. And Descartes said that the point of his whole philosophy was to prove the existence of God and the reality and immortality of the human soul. So the two are not that far apart, but although they believed the same science and the same religion, their philosophies are as different as head and heart, logic and faith, objective and subjective, theoretical and practical, classical and romantic, rationalist and existentialist, sciences and humanities, the two cultures that today divide our souls and our world. The two hands of Augustine, the open book and the burning heart, are now, in modern times, offered by two different philosophers, not one. Descartes is Augustine's book without a heart, and Pascal is Augustine's burning heart without a book. The Pensées is not a book. It is about 1,000 short notes for a book, and if the book had been actually written, it would have been a book against books, like Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. The two spouses in Aquinas' marriage of faith and reason have separated, though they have not yet divorced. Neither Descartes nor Pascal ever spoke of or believed in that great modern myth, the so-called war between science and religion, which is the most fake war in history because it has 0 casualties. Not a single dogma of religion has ever been disproved by a single discovery of any science, and that is simply a historical fact that has never been disproved. And the myth can be believed only if we confine ourselves to those two vague abstractions, science and religion, instead of specific religious dogmas and specific scientific discoveries. To show how pervasive these differences between Pascal and Descartes are, I'll briefly contrast these two in 12 different areas of philosophy. The aim or goal or purpose of their philosophy, and their method of philosophizing, and their logical structure and progression of the plot, so to speak, of their philosophy, and their theory of human knowing or epistemology, and their philosophical anthropology or philosophy of human nature, and their cosmology or man's relation to nature, and their metaphysics, and their philosophical theology, and their ethics or personal good, and their social ethics or political good, and their philosophy of evil, and finally their philosophy of death. And since we touched on a few of these items in my previous lecture on Descartes, I'll summarize Descartes much more briefly and Pascal more at length. The aim of philosophy for Descartes is very high. He sees philosophy as the foundation and justification for all the other sciences, since philosophy justifies and validates human reason itself. Although, as we saw when examining Descartes earlier, it is not clear how reason can prove itself, any more than how any human being can cause itself. Even God is not self-caused, but uncaused. The philosophical justification for human reason for Descartes is the foundation for the skyscraper that is science and its application, technology. And that skyscraper is to be mankind's new home, eventually a kind of heaven on earth, a utopia. Philosophy for Descartes is terribly important, not for its own sake, but for the sciences, and the sciences, in turn, are important chiefly for what Bacon called man's conquest of nature by technology, which Descartes believed was unlimited in its applications to human life and perhaps even death, as we shall see shortly. Eventually, Descartes prophesies, the sciences will answer every problem, both theoretical and practical, eliminate all ignorance, and dissolve all mysteries. We will no longer need a Socrates to remind us of our ignorance, or a God to remind Job that life is a mystery to be lived, not a puzzle to be solved. Pascal, perhaps in deliberate reaction to this rationalism, writes that philosophy is worth about a half-hour's trouble. We have the right to say that too, but only after we have written a book as good as Pascal's Pensées, and not before. Pascal says that Plato and Aristotle, their real philosophical wisdom was not what they wrote, but how they lived with their families and their friends. The ultimate philosophical question, the question of God, for Pascal, was to be answered not by an abstract and impersonal proof, however valid it may be, but by a concrete and personal wager, a bet, a leap of faith and hope, which is made not by the mind but by the heart, not by the reason but by the will and its free choice. For Pascal, the four most important philosophical questions were the meaning of ourselves, of God, of life, and of death. And the only adequate answer that we have or ever can have to all four of those questions was Jesus Christ. Pascal said to know him is to know the meaning of those four things, and not to know him is not to know those meanings. What is the purpose of philosophy then? Descartes thought of philosophy as a powerful and unlimitedly successful means to the end of man's conquest of nature. Pascal thought of philosophy as a weak and very limitedly successful means in his own hands to the end of God's conquest of man. Since method depends on purpose, and since there is this radical contrast between Descartes and Pascal about philosophy's purpose, there is an equally radical contrast about its method. For Descartes, it is the scientific method, which had proved so successful in all the other sciences that Descartes quite naturally tried to apply it to philosophy. Its four basic rules, as Descartes formulated them, are to begin with universal doubt, to demand clear and distinct ideas, as in mathematics, to proceed deductively from the simple to the complex, and therefore to use analysis rather than intuition or synthesis, and finally to compensate for any omissions or mistakes by a universal review. Descartes assumed that this is as possible in philosophy as it is in the sciences, and as possible in the other sciences as it is in mathematics. Of course, those two assumptions have never been verified in practice, and very few philosophers and far fewer ordinary people believe anymore that they're valid even in theory. In contrast, Pascal's method, he says, is like the method for playing an organ. The organ is man, and as he says, you have to know what keys to press. That's the method Jesus used. So did Socrates. Since the purpose is personal, the method must be personal and practical. You can't first learn it and then do it. The only way to learn it is by doing it. But neither Jesus nor Socrates, the two greatest teachers, ignored the dimension of the logical and the impersonal and the objective. No one ever defeated them in an argument or found a fallacy in their reasoning. For they also used a kind of scientific method, but a much more basic one, and Pascal follows them there. Their method is first of all inductive rather than deductive. It begins with experience, and experience is complex, not simple. So the method must move not from simple to complex, like Descartes' deduction, but from complex to simple, like induction. In all the sciences except mathematics, all hypotheses or theories or principles are to be tested and validated by the data that we experience. And Pascal begins by summarizing the four most important pieces of data that the experience of ourselves and of our lives gives to all of us. That we all seek happiness, that we all find unhappiness, that we all seek certain truth, and that we all find errors and doubts. In other words, in the most famous words of the most famous modern philosopher, you can't always get what you want, and I can't yet know satisfaction. There isn't much good philosophy of music, but there's a lot of good philosophy in music. Any philosophy that does not explain, or even try to explain, this fourfold data is not worth our time. Any key that does not fit that lock is worthless. And a key that does is worth everything. And Christ is exactly that key. So Pascal first explores the lock, which is our bad news, then the key, which is God's good news, the gospel, and the fit between the key and the lock. Pascal has the reputation of being a pessimist because he explores many corridors in the data of our discontent, our vanity of vanities, like the later existentialists, both atheistic and Christian, and all the earlier existentialists, like the author of Ecclesiastes and St. Augustine. Why does he do that pessimistic thing? Because that's the data that needs to be explained. Classical arguments for God's existence usually begin with the good news, positive perfections such as order and design in the universe, or the moral law and our knowledge of it and of eternal truths. From design we move to a superhuman designer, from the law to a superhuman lawgiver, and from eternal ideas to a superhuman eternal mind. But Pascal, in contrast, begins with the negative data, our unhappiness and our uncertainty, which bite deeper still and demand a practical as well as a theoretical solution. This is not pessimism. This is realism. Descartes' method, the scientific method, assumes that we are detached observers. Pascal's method assumes that we are involved participants in the problem. What standard, then, shall we use to compare these two methods? Well, why not ask which of the two assumptions is the true one? Because of this contrast in method, Descartes and Pascal also contrast in terms of the logical plot or progression of their philosophy. Descartes' philosophy is a string of theoretical problem-solving logical deductions, almost like Euclid's geometry, whereas Pascal's philosophy is like a journey of exploration into a mystery, a hero's journey, like all the great stories, a search for the key that opens the lock that is the mystery of human misery, human ignorance, human vanity, and human injustice. Descartes' progression ends with the prediction of a man-made creation of an earthly paradise by means of our science and technology. Pascal's progression ends with man's surrender to Christ by means of faith, the leap of faith, which he logically justifies not by a deduction, but by a wager. Descartes' philosophy is a deduction, Pascal's is a drama. Epistemology, the philosophical science of how knowledge works and how it ought to work, is closely connected with method. Descartes' epistemology is rationalist and deductive and mathematical. He tells us that mathematics was the only course he took in college that satisfied him because what he wanted above all was certainty. Descartes claims to exorcise mystery. Pascal plunges into mystery. Descartes wants a God's eye view of things without any appeal to faith or divine revelation. He is a system builder, a builder of a tower of words, which for Pascal is the Tower of Babel. Pascal does not try to scrape the sky with a great building. He bores down like a spelunker, a cave explorer. He digs into the earth of our experience. Descartes explores essences, Pascal explores existence. Pascal's epistemology is rational but not rationalistic. It does not neglect or demean reason and logic and argument, but it centers on experience and intuition, the eye of the heart. He contrasts the intuitive mind with the geometrical mind, contrasts the heart with the head. And by heart he means not emotion and feeling, but intuition or seeing rather than proving. He famously says, "The heart has its reasons, which the reason does not know." The heart has eyes. Anthropology is the science of man, the science of anthropos. Epistemology then depends on anthropology, for how man knows depends upon what man is. Descartes' anthropology is a kind of Gnostic rationalism, an identification of man with mind, mind with reason, reason with logic, and logic with definition and deduction. Pascal uses logical argument too, but he sees man as centered in the heart, and he means by the heart not what Hallmark greeting cards or pop psychology mean by it, but what the Bible means by it. Not feelings, but the pre-functional root of both feeling and thinking, and of willing and choosing and loving. I speak of my thinking, my feeling, my willing, my loving. Who is that I? Well, the heart is that personal center which owns the thinking and feeling and willing and loving. It is the single trunk of all the branches of that tree. Solomon writes, "Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life." The heart is above all the source of loving. Pascal, who wrote under the influence of Augustine, sees love as man's essence and man's destiny. Amor meus pandus meum, Augustine said. My love is my gravity. That's why Pascal says in the Pensées that evangelists and apologists must first make us want to believe in Christ first show his lovability, and then show that this love is true, rather than vice versa. The Greeks told us to love according to reason. The Bible tells us to reason according to love. Thus, where Descartes distinguishes two levels of the self, body and mind, Pascal distinguishes three: body, mind, and heart, or biology, rationality, and charity, life, light, and love, also three biblical categories, and St. John's three favorite words for God: Zoe, Logos, and Agape. As epistemology depends on anthropology, anthropology depends on metaphysics. Just as how man knows depends on what man is, so what man is depends on what is real, on what it means to be. So where do Descartes and Pascal differ in their metaphysics? Well, neither Descartes nor Pascal are materialists or immaterialists, and both believe that the touchstone and standard for reality is God, the same God. They're both believing Catholics. So I see no metaphysical difference between the two philosophers, which is surprising, since everything else in philosophy depends on metaphysics, and yet these two philosophers differ radically about almost everything else, and yet not about the content of metaphysics, though they do differ about its value. Descartes spending a lot of time here, and Pascal not much, because Pascal sees that most men are minimally moved by metaphysics. So evidently, the dependence of the other divisions of philosophy on metaphysics is not a dependence of deduction, of conclusion on premises, because if it were, then Descartes and Pascal would have the same conclusions, since they have the same metaphysical premises. In other words, philosophers do not start with metaphysics and deduce everything else from it. They usually start at the other end, with conclusions, and then find premises to prove them. They begin with beliefs about more concrete issues, about man and values and loves, and then they erect abstract metaphysical principles and premises to support these conclusions. In other words, loves and hearts do in fact come first. And Pascal knows this, while Descartes does not. And I think perhaps that is their greatest difference about metaphysics. It's a difference not in content, but in focus. Both are supernaturalists, not naturalists, but Pascal focuses on the supernatural and Descartes on the natural. Both believe in God, but God is only of theoretical interest, not practical interest for Descartes. He uses God only as his bridge between his knowledge of himself, which is the thing he begins with, and his knowledge of the world, which is what he ends with. He first proves his own existence, then proves God's existence and nature's. But God is in the middle. He does not let God be the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the ending of his whole philosophy. And he does not invoke God as the solution to the problems of human life. He does not connect his theoretical God with his practical human life. Pascal does. And that's why Pascal speaks not just of God, but of Christ. Christ is God made present, God in man and in human life. Faith, hope, and charity are Pascal's essential answers to the questions of epistemology and anthropology and ethics, respectively. In his epistemology, Pascal invokes God and his divine revelation and our faith in it as the only solution to our uncertainty. In his anthropology, Pascal invokes God and his promises and our hope in them as the only solution to our vanity and hopelessness. And in his ethics, Pascal invokes God and his divine charity and our receiving it and reflecting it as the only solution to our unhappiness and misery. This program impacts Pascal's metaphysics and produces the one substantial difference in content with Descartes. For where Descartes has only two levels of reality in his metaphysics, matter and mind, Pascal has three: matter, mind, and charity, divine love, agape, which he explicitly says is supernatural, unlike nature and natural reason, the other two metaphysical levels. In their philosophy of God, Pascal and Descartes see God somewhat differently, though neither is an explicit theological heretic. Descartes sees God and the image of God in man as primarily mind, while Pascal sees God and the image of God in man as primarily the heart and love. When he had his mystical experience that changed his life, Pascal, like Moses, saw God not as a light, but as a fire. That was his word, fire. For God is love, according to God's own word, and love is a fire, according to those who are not just students of love, but lovers. Pascal's Augustinian primacy of the heart and love cannot be just in anthropology, but it must also have consequences in his metaphysics, since man is made in the image of God. As for ethics, Descartes has none, except 4 purely pragmatic and temporary pieces of advice about how to live with the least trouble while one is doing the really important thing, which is science and technology. It took Kant to fill in the missing piece in Descartes' rationalistic philosophy by constructing a purely rational ethics, in fact, an almost mathematically rational ethics, one without a metaphysics and without a philosophical anthropology or psychology, both of which Kant's epistemology made impossible because his Copernican revolution in philosophy denied to us the knowledge of things in themselves, or objective reality. Thus, true to Descartes' rationalism, Kant's ethics appeals to no ordinary empirical experience, no human nature, no habits, no virtues and vices, as do both Aristotle and Pascal. As for politics, the main impact Descartes' philosophy has is his claim that his use of the scientific method in philosophy will end all disagreements in philosophy, including political philosophy. Science was, in fact, succeeding remarkably in all other areas, so it was reasonable for Descartes to hope that it would do the same in social ethics or politics, and this would end wars. The hope has a very personal and experiential source. Descartes came up with his philosophy after what he deemed a mystical dream from the Spirit of Truth, while he was being snowbound on the way back from Germany to France after being traumatized by the battlefields of the 30 Years' War, a religious and ideological war that devastated non-combatant populations as no war had ever done. Needless to say, Descartes' dream of peace has not come true. Pascal, on the other hand, is, as usual, the realist and the empirical observer rather than the rationalist and the idealist, in speaking of the vanity of human justice and the gap between the true natural moral law and the follies of human thought and behavior. He has read chapter 19 of Augustine's City of God. Collectively and socially and publicly, as well as individually and privately, he first tells us the bad news of man's unhappiness without God. And then he tells us the good news of man's happiness with God. And he labels these as the 2 major points, the 2 major halves of his classic, the Pensées. Politics is mentioned in the first half, but not in the second. So Pascal implicitly sees politics as part of our problem. Descartes implicitly sees it as part of our solution. Of course, both being Christians would agree with Christ that we should render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God, but they would draw that line of demarcation differently. What do our 2 philosophers say about sin and about moral evil? Chesterton says that the dogma of original sin is the only Christian dogma that can be proved simply by reading the daily newspapers. Pascal spends half of his Pensées giving us empirical evidence of sin and evil and wickedness and vanity and its consequent misery in all areas of human life. Sin is the main problem in human life, the thing God came to earth to save us from. The angel did not say to Joseph, "You shall call his name Jesus or Savior because he will save you from political incorrectness or even from suffering." What does Descartes say about sin? He speaks of sin or moral evil only once, and it is significant that the only time he does is when he speaks of his scientific discoveries in physics. He writes, "I believed that I could not keep them hidden away without greatly sinning." Sinning against what? Descartes answers that question in the next sentence, against the Baconian summum bonum, to make ourselves masters and possessors of nature. And then he speaks in this context of infinity or limitlessness, a divine attribute that he does not explicitly speak of when he speaks of God. He writes, "This is desirable not only for the invention of an infinity of devices that would enable us to enjoy without pain the fruits of the earth and all the goods one finds in it, but principally for the maintenance of health, which unquestionably is the first good and the foundation of all other goods in this life. For the mind depends so greatly upon the temperament and the dispositions of the organs of the body that, were it possible to find some means to make men more wise, I believe one should look to medicine to find this means. It is true that the medicine currently practiced contains little of such usefulness, but in this field everything that we know is almost nothing in comparison to what remains to be known, and we might rid ourselves of an infinity of maladies, both of body and mind, and perhaps also of the enfeeblement brought on by old age, if one were to have a sufficient knowledge of their cause. Well, we know today that their cause is genetic, and we have broken the genetic code, and we are learning how to replace God's and nature's encoding with our own. And if we do that by eliminating not just diseases, but also death, we will have radically reinterpreted John Donne's pious poetic prophecy, "Death, thou shalt die," so as to put the conquest of death under our control, not Christ's. That would be playing God in almost exactly the same way as a mother who justifies aborting her own child when she plays God and radically reinterprets Christ's Eucharistic words, "This is my body." She says those same words, but to take life rather than to give it. This is my body. Satan loves to blaspheme, and he revels in turning the most holy words spoken on earth onto their heads, to signify the deed of Antichrist rather than Christ, of the Dracula who takes our blood rather than the deed of Christ who gives us his own divine blood and body. Frankenstein is one of the most popular stories ever written, although it is far from a literary masterpiece. Why is it so popular? Because we instinctively know that science fiction inevitably becomes scientific fact. Why should the technology of artificial immortality be an exception to that rule? Descartes tells us to doubt everything, but he writes in a letter to Burnham that it should not be doubted that human life could be prolonged if we knew the appropriate art. Prolonged. How long? Why should there be any end at all? Why not complete man's conquest of nature by conquering death itself, nature's trump card? Have we ever invented a new art or power that we don't want to use? The actual scientific discovery and invention that springs to mind is, of course, nuclear bombs. What would Descartes say about that wonderful piece of progress? Would he be surprised to see its consequences in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Most sane human beings, aware of what Christianity calls original sin, would love to put that genie back into the bottle, if they could, to close the Pandora's box that our pride and greed for power has opened. But once that apple is eaten, it cannot be uneaten. And when death's door is closed, the door to heaven is closed. And if that happens, Pascal will prove to have been much too naive and optimistic. Let us pray that it does not happen.